pause here. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Robert Krieger for the Kosmos Society, an online community for the exploration and study of the ancient world, guided by traditional classical studies, modern online tools, and our interest in the ancient Greek world. Membership to the Kosmos Society is by application at our website and is open to all interested people, and there's no charge, no cost. Among other learning activities, we offer reading groups for original ancient Greek and Latin works, both in English translation and in the original languages. We particularly encourage non-professionals who are seeking a welcoming environment for learning and discussion. Today, we're here for Kosmos Society's Open House Conversation Series, a periodic discussion we hold with interesting leaders in the study of the ancient world. Our speaker is Professor Christopher Brown. Okay. All right, has my screen sharing gone off? I'm sorry. Okay. All right, let me introduce Professor Brown. He is a member of the Department of Classical Studies at Western University, Ontario. Been there for almost 40 years, or maybe 40 years. He's a William Sherwood Fox Professor of Classics. His research interests include Greek poetry, drama, religion, pre-Socratics, and Roman poetry. Today, he'll be talking to us on the topic of Ares, Aphrodite, and a monkey's rump, some thoughts of public humiliation. But before he begins his presentation, I want to welcome you, Professor Brown, and I want to ask you a question we'd like to ask all our speakers, which is how you first got interested in the ancient world and classics.
Well, I suppose my story is a pretty ordinary one, and it has everything to do with a very gifted and engaged teacher. I entered high school with this strange idea, it's a quaint idea really, that an educated person should know Latin. I signed up for Latin. First day of class, the Latin teacher came in and said, "I hope some of you will come out tomorrow morning before class, before school, and start studying ancient Greek with me." And I thought this was something like, the chess club or the camera club. Well, I went out for it and was a little bit surprised to find a mark on my report card in December. But I also got hooked. And this teacher, he was a really remarkable guy. He taught a full load of Latin and then a full load of Greek before and after school, at lunch, and during his spares. And he was rigorous. I remember having to translate speeches by Churchill into Greek and Latin, which was kind of fun. He also was indulgent. He found out that I liked poetry, and so we read a lot of Homer together. So by the time I was midway through high school, I was totally hooked. And, when I look at what I've done, become a professor of classics, my wife asked someone the other day, what other job would you want if you couldn't do what you're doing? I couldn't think of one. So, it's that kind of thing. And, you do crazy things when you're a teenager, and sometimes you pay for them for the rest of your life.
What a great tribute to a instructor, to a teacher.
Well, they're out there, and I think most of us have had them. People who've gone above and beyond, and then beyond the beyond.
All right, so I'll invite you to share your screen, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, let me see where it went. And there we go. So this feels a bit odd for me. I am, in a sense, returning to the scene of a crime, because I did write on this a long time ago. And I've tried not to go back and revisit things that I've written on because some scholars get kind of territorial about their ideas and their conclusions and spend the rest of their lives fighting off the enemy. But, I find that this discipline is such that most of the interesting questions are never going to be answered in a way that satisfies everybody. And scholarship does march on. So I want to pick up really a piece of this passage that I didn't explore way back in 1989. And so, Ares and Aphrodite, you all know where we're going. Eighth book. The monkey's rear end, however, the monkey's rump, that will come a little bit later. And we will find out about this poor, rather uncomfortable looking fellow on the screen. Believe it or not, it's actually sort of relevant. Um, if you look at it in the right way after that glass of wine that we can't share later on. So you all know the story of Ares and Aphrodite from Iliad or Odyssey 8. It's sung by Demodocus the bard after the athletic competition in which Odysseus in particular has struggled with Euryalus. And Demodocus sings of the adultery of Ares and Aphrodite and how her husband Hephaestus found out about it from the sun and got his revenge by laying a trap. And when the lovers went to bed, the trap ensnared them, and Hephaestus turns up and summons the gods, who come and laugh. There's a certain amount of banter that goes on, but there's also a certain amount of seriousness. Poseidon, who does not appear to have a sense of humor at all, continues to worry about Ares and freeing him. The passage ends with what I think suggests a divorce. Aphrodite's, was married, I think, as an ad hoc innovation here, and that marriage gets annulled at the end of the passage. Question is, what do we make of this passage? And in particular, one of the harder points is, just who's being laughed at and what does that laughter mean? And some of that I picked up way back when. And of course, like most articles, people have agreed with it and people have disagreed with it. And of course, the challenge with Homer is, not unlike the challenge with most other ancient authors, and that is to try and find a kind of frame in which we can think about the text. How seriously do we take it? What do we make of its constituent parts, its language, its episodes, and how they relate to each other? And many scholars will have different ideas. Certainly, I've taken the line, and I'll put my cards on the table now, that the Odyssey, like the Iliad, like many other of our central texts, is a meaningful text. I don't like the idea of extracting messages from literature, but I think that great literature is good to think with, as the anthropologists like to say. And the Odyssey makes us think about things, makes us think about the organization of human society, family, dynamic of what it means to be human. It does begin andromoene musa. And so I think of it as a poem that is meaningful. And in that light, I'm inclined to read it as the product of purposeful construction, in which its constituent parts are not a random assemblage of stuff, but are a meaningful assemblage of stuff. There are different traditions lurking in the background, different versions of many of the core episodes, but what we get is a version that makes a certain amount of sense. We find this a bit in antiquity, and I want to begin with this passage because it's mentioned occasionally, but not thought about a lot. Athenaeus, as you all know, preserves half of lost ancient literature. Without Athenaeus, most of us would have a part-time job, not a full-time job. There's so much comedy and minor historians, and he says all sorts of interesting things. He says a few crazy things too. But he tells a story, and I've given you the Greek text. I've also quoted the relatively recent Loeb, and I will say up front that, Olson in producing a new lobe did a really good service for the discipline. An up-to-date lobe of Athenaeus is useful. I am going to take issue with his translation a bit, but that's, you put it out there and people do that, right? So picks it up by after the athletic contest, the bard sings a story, and that's should be Odyssey 8, but I can't type, about Ares' lovemaking, which involves a bit of mockery. Although hints are also offered to Odysseus about the killing of the suitors, since Clubfoot defeats Ares, the paragon of masculinity. It's a really interesting statement. Wish I knew where it came from. Athenaeus often does declare his sources. And we do find, for example, nuggets of lost Xenodotian Homeric lore buried in Athenaeus. Here he doesn't tell us. I will take issue a bit with Olson's translation, though, because if you look at it, he somehow, I think, has seemed to attach Tinna to Chloe. A bit of mockery. It actually says after the athletic competition, the bard sings a certain myth, and we all know which one, about the lovemaking of Ares that involves mockery. Not a bit of mockery. It involves mockery. Moreover, hints are also offered. Huputhekai means suggestions as a sort of neutral word. It can also mean warnings, but it seems to me that it's a good deal stronger than hints. Whatever we make of it, this passage does suggest that this song, the adultery of Ares and Aphrodite, punishment of the adulterous pair, the response, has something to say to Odysseus as he sits in the audience listening. Not everybody takes this line. And, as I said, you publish something and then scholarship marches on. Martin West has produced, a study of the Odyssey and a new Teubner edition in recent years. And, this is an important event. And he takes a very different view of the Odyssey. And I quote just a little bit to give you a sort of sense. He says, in summarizing this section, Demodocus' second song is a secondary expansion. Q, and I'll come back to Q in a minute, has inserted an independent piece from his own repertoire. Now, West, who, like most of us, does not believe Homer is a real name and a real person, named the Iliad poet P, and the Odyssey poet he calls Q. This has nothing to do with James Bond, as he avers in his preface, although it's irresistible in some ways. But West, who, if you read his book on the making of the Odyssey, there's a lot about how it was put together, and in his view, often badly. For him, Q is a kind of occasionally ham-fisted runner-up to P in poetic excellence. There's almost nothing in West's book that suggests that he thinks the poem actually has anything to say or make us think about. And I'm reminded, I maybe shouldn't tell this in public, but I'm reminded of talking to West in the kitchen of one of my colleagues once long ago about the time my first article appeared. And he said to me, people keep talking about meaning and interpretation with the Odyssey. It's just stories. And while he never ever says that clearly in his book, it's there. Now, if you accept that kind of view of Homer, then this piece, an independent piece from the repertoire of the Q poet, is just an add-on. And it is possible to take that. It's very hard. There are many of these positions which are really just articles of faith. The kind of assumed ground upon which you will build an interpretation or not build an interpretation. And so this tendency to see the Odyssey as a compilation of stuff without necessarily being a thorough composed poem really does inform many of the decisions that West makes in his Teubner. Now, it was published after his death. The preface by his wife suggests that it was all but finished. That may be so. I have to say that as I've lived with this edition, I've thought that it wasn't nearly as finished as that preface would suggest. I found a lot of stuff where points were, especially in dealing with the secondary tradition, where there are interesting things that just aren't there. And if you look at his Iliad, Teubner, such things were there. I stress this because in many ways, this reading, the linchpin of any reading of this passage, hinges on a particular bit of Greek and a particular textual issue. So when Hephaestus summons the gods to come, this is the passage that I've quoted here, and I'm quoting the Loeb, we have the text which was up until what the most common text. Father Zeus, you and other blessed gods that are forever, come hither, and you may see a matter laughable and unendurable. They come, they laugh. If you look at the foot apparatus that I've reproduced there, this is one of those really remarkable cases where there are two ancient readings that are really the same text, just divided differently, that change everything. And, so I've got reading number A, Erga Galasta, and that's what the old Oxford text prints. The Italian edition in the Mondadori series, that's been my go-to text for most of my career. But West now prints the other reading, Erg Agalasta. So really, it's just drawing the line differently, right? And that would mean come and see an unfunny and unendurable matter, literally things unlaughable and unendurable. If we accept that, without doubt, the gods come, they laugh up a storm. Who is the butt of the joke here? Hephaestus. His vengeance blows up in his face. If he says, come and see something that deserves laughter, then he gets what he wants. And in my earlier article, I argued that what this is all about is about the laughter of mockery. That laughing at the adulterous pair is a public humiliation that they deserve as adulterers. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to defend that. I have some defense of that reading in my early article. I think now, in fact, I would make a stronger case for that reading because West and a couple of other people have printed the unlaughable bit. Galasta is the difficilior lectio. It was clearly read by Aristarchus and Herodian, who talks about its accent. The more recent edition of the Scholia to the Odyssey by Filippo Maria Pontani also gives us a little more ammunition. Clearly, it was read in different strands of the scholastic tradition. So I would defend it. And I would argue that he summons them to come and laugh. They do. He wins. Just as Athenaeus says, right? Clubfoot beats Ares, as he does in a couple of other myths. So that's the reading I advanced, and I while I probably write a different article today, I still think that's fundamentally the right approach here. What I didn't talk about at any length in that article, and what has actually come to interest me, is the trap. All this hinges on a clever trap, right? We see that in this second passage, right? He goes into his smithy and he makes this wondrous trap and puts it around the bed, and as soon as they start making out, they're caught. And then the gods come and they laugh at them. And it's quite clear from the third passage, that's exactly what happens, right? Then at length they realize there was no escaping. They're bound in fetters, right? The word desmos is used. So it's interesting. So this may just be a sort of magic thing. And there are some parallels for that. There's an interesting myth about that seems to have been told by Alcaeus, but doesn't really surface until the end of antiquity, in which Hephaestus gets his mother back, who rejects him at birth by trapping her in a throne. And Ares is sent to negotiate her freedom, and he loses. And Dionysus finally wins by liquoring him up and getting him to free his mother. We also have, a tradition of chained gods. Even Ares in one inscription is chained, presumably an image of him in cult. But the trap here is one that I think deserves to be looked at maybe from a slightly broader, different perspective. And in my earlier article, and here's where that poor humiliated monkey is coming in, I did compare an Aesopic fable. I think the fables of Aesop are fascinating, and they aren't read nearly as much as they ought to be. And this is a story that we know Archilochus told in an epode. So it has an early pedigree, and that's, I think, not unsignificant. So a monkey danced, wound up being chosen king of the animals, and this aroused the envy of a fox. And what the fox does is actually traps him and exposes his rear end to public ridicule. All right, and the text we have in the Aesopic fables, the fox says, "Monkey with a pugae like that, and a rump like that, are you king of the animals?" Manuscripts give a couple of other things, and when my earlier paper, I printed pugae or pugain there, as West does, and as my colleague Doug Gerber does in his Loeb, and that's probably almost certainly what Archilochus said. I no longer would print this with Aesop because I've become quite interested in evidence for Baudelarizing some of these fables in the tradition that we have. But basically, when we look at our evidence for Archilochus's poem, we have some hints of that story. And indeed, as my colleague Doug translates that last fragment, "Monkey with an ass like yours, dot, dot, dot." This seems to me to reflect a mechanism that was probably not uncommon at the popular level in ancient culture and even more modern culture. And that is punishment that comes through a display and public humiliation, public laughter. So it's interesting. So I've been collecting examples of this, and I've been going down some pretty strange rabbit holes on and off looking for odd things. And I found a lot of this. There's a really good discussion of it in a paper by Kurt Latta. I sent a handout out with the bibliography if you're really interested. Kurt Latta, brilliant scholar, who not only talks about the ancient evidence, but also makes comparisons with more recent Germany. Putting people in things like the stocks, public display was important. And we know about this from the ancient world. So there's a reference to the Kuphon or Kuphones in Aristophanes, and our Scholia, the wonderful Scholia to Aristophanes, gives us a definition. They say that the Kuphones were wooden fetters into which the convicted put their necks, and for this reason they were forced to stoop. Obviously etymologizing kuphon from the verb kupto, the root of the verb kupto. And of course, what we imagine, is something not unlike this, where people were put out on display for various transgressions, and the community could pass a judgment through mockery, and also maybe through rotten fruit, too. I love this picture. These guys just look so comfortable there. You really need a couple of rotten tomatoes and a couple of dog turds, I think, to give it the sort of right ambiance. But this is a kind of public humiliation that's been practiced for a long time. Now, if you look at the article that I published long ago, I have an appendix on how mockery as a form of popular justice runs through European history right down to the 19th century. This kind of thing is not uncommon. give you a couple of other examples because they're kind of fun. Anacreon describes a guy who was a low life, who became a high life, and maybe an effeminate person. That's another article. But he describes his low life early years as often he had his neck in the stocks, often on the wheel, often his back was flogged with a leather whip and his hair and beard plucked out. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And we have, we have other devices here. We have a wheel. I'll come back to the wheel a little bit later. We've got the stocks. We've got whipping. This is about a certain kind of public display. Lysias has a passage in which a law of Solon is quoted about the podokake, and it's about the convicted person shall have his foot confined in the podokake for 10 days. And we make it clear that this is the same as being in the wood. Public display, and presumably public mockery. Demosthenes talks about a similar situation. If a man was found guilty on a private prosecution for theft, there could be an added penalty of imprisonment, right? Desmos, that's the same language that's used actually of Ares and Aphrodite in Homer, for a period of time so that everybody might see the thief bound. This is not private suffering. It's not being locked away. It's being set out on display, and that brings a loss of stature, especially in a society like ancient society, in which values of shame are so important. Adultery figures prominently in these stories, and I've got a couple of examples here. Aeolian tells the story on Crete that an adulterer, when caught, was brought before the magistrates, and after conviction was made to wear a garland of wool. The garland amounted to accusation, probably an accusation, that he was unmanly and effeminate, and had looks appealing to women. The poem of Anacreon seems to attack this character named Ardamon by accusing him of effeminacy. A very common kind of attack on the comic stage. Furthermore, he was obliged to pay the state 50 staters, suffered complete loss of rights, and took no part in public affairs. So he was made to wear something, to be seen wearing something, and this is accompanied by a loss of status. We're going down a deep rabbit hole when we get Heraclides of Lembus, but this is interesting stuff. In Lepreon, right, in the Peloponnese, if the Lepreates apprehended adulterers, they led them, I can't type, around the city for 3 days in fetters and disenfranchised them for life. They make women stand in the marketplace for 11 days, ungirt in a transparent ketone, and disenfranchise her. Just shameful. If you think of Herodotus's famous story of Candaules' wife, right, who being seen naked, was a loss. A woman takes off her clothes, she takes off her shame. We have passages from comedy. I'm thinking in particular of a fragment of Eubulus that talks about prostitutes being on display, describes them as gumnae, naked, but also makes it clear they're wearing just diaphanous stuff. The adulterous woman here is reduced to being a prostitute and with a total loss of status. We have another fragment of Nicolaus of Damascus. If an adulterer should be caught, he is led around the city along with the woman for a prescribed number of days. They're put on display, and that ultimately destroys their standing. Second Greek question is an interesting one. Who was the woman who rode on a donkey at Cumae? An adulterous woman. They used to bring into the marketplace and set her on a certain stone in plain sight of everyone. Again, the public display. In like manner, they then proceed to mount her upon a donkey. And when she had been about the circuit of the entire city, she was required to take her stand upon the same stone, and for the rest of her life continue in disgrace, bearing the name donkey rider. After this ceremony, they believed that the stone was unclean, and they used to ritually purify it. So again, we have this adultery and a loss of status through, if not confinement, at least a kind of confinement before the public, a public display. Myth does, so these are what we've seen so far. These are stories that come from the sort of lower level of things, I suppose. You know, we hear it in the periphery of court trials. Comic poets will allude to it. These things also percolate into myth in interesting ways. And I'm thinking this as a kind of parallel for Ares and Aphrodite. Ixion was one of the great sinners. And what was his punishment? For attempted adultery, trying to rape Hera, he was put on a wheel. Right? We have a reference to the wheel in the Anacreon fragment, and there are others. These sinners, of course, have a habit of migrating to the underworld. And certainly when we come to Roman literature, Ixion's down there, right? He gets to stop spinning on his wheel to listen to Orpheus in Georgics 4. But in the earliest version, Pindar's second Pythian, he's clearly in the air. And in his tormented state, spinning on his wheel, he speaks a moral for everyone. And again, this idea of a kind of public message is clear. There's an interesting myth, and this I'm going to gloss over very quickly, but the story of Heracles and the Cercopes is fascinating. Archilochus seems to have embedded a reference to this in his famous epode against Lycambes, because the story tells us that these Cercopes, these monkey brothers, these sort of disruptor brothers, were warned by their mother to beware of a person with a black rear end. Here we're back to rumps, right? In this case, it turns out to be Heracles, whose at least hairy rear end they saw when he had punished them. His punishment is interesting. He traps them and carries them about in a kind of uncomfortable public display. The myth is not really told in detail until late antiquity. Really, we have to sort of quarry it out of texts like Zonorus and Zenobius. Sorry, not Zonorus, Zenobius. But art gives us this myth early, and this is one of the wonderful metopes from the temple at Selinunte. And there's Heracles and these two brothers who are sort of on display. Rear ends maybe not so prominent, but their position is unnatural. And he paraded them around. This is a case where he's actually caged them, trapped them, and is bringing them to some sort of a leader. Clearly a kind of comic vase of a familiar kind. But the trapping of these miscreant brothers and displaying them is this same kind of mechanism. So myth sometimes distills some of these ordinary kinds of punishments and uses them as narrative motifs. We even get things like this, and I'm going to be very brief with this. You know, in the Iliad, there's this famous passage we hear about basically Zeus the wife beater, to use the title of David Schapp's interesting article. But Zeus punishing his own wife violently through public display. Like the story of Ares and Aphrodite, this made many ancient commentators quite uncomfortable, and it was allegorized in all sorts of ways that bleach away from it the taint of domestic violence. But it seems to me that it spirals out of a very basic mechanism of ancient culture, and that is the way in which mockery, public shaming, can be an effective way of addressing certain kinds of crimes. Now, to bring this back to Ares and Aphrodite, so the gods come and they laugh. There's also a certain amount of laughter that follows. We get a celebrated dirty joke, right, where Hermes says he'd actually endure worse to get to go to bed with Aphrodite, and the gods laugh unextinguishably again. On my reading, which, is not the only way to read this, some readings, Hephaestus gets laughed at, they laugh again, they're not taking this matter seriously. And there is a sense in which it isn't as serious here. And that has a lot to do, I think, with the Homeric gods. The Homeric gods are remarkable. I mean, they're such an important and integral part of Homeric narrative. And yet, they are also curiously less serious. It's a wonderful phrase by Karl Reinhardt in his famous paper on the judgment of Paris, Das Paris-Urteil, where he talked about the treatment of the Olympians being characterized by ein erhabener Unernst, a sublime unseriousness. It's an amazing phrase. Reinhardt was one of those really interesting characters. It is sublime, it's divine, but in the end, the gods cannot die. The gods cannot face the same kinds of consequences of their actions as mortals. And so in the court of the Phaeacians, Odysseus hears about this. It is resolved. Ares is released with the penalty. Aphrodite seems as divorced. But Odysseus himself is sitting there knowing that he's coming home to find troubles in his house. And he does. And he settles that. He restores the order to his household as Hephaestus restores order to his, not through something as mild as public mockery, but through bloodshed and killing all the suitors. Always in Homer, the stakes for human beings are much higher and much more serious than they are for the gods, who are forever. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to switch here to gallery view for so we can discuss some questions. All right. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to give Helen the first question because she had put a comment on real early in the conversation. So, Jackie, I'll let you go second. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think I have some observations like the parallelism between the Song of Demodocus and the incident with Ares and Hephaestus and Odysseus' bed, because I have seen sometimes in my opinion, the wording or the phrasing in Homer leads us to make parallelisms between some passages. So what I had observed is that when Hephaestus constructs these the chains, this invisible chain with which he captures the adulterers. The word for it in Greek is arachnia, like very thin, like a spider's thread. And we also see about Telemachus talking about Odysseus' bed, like when he wants to return to Ithaca, right before returning to Ithaca or right after returning to Ithaca. He has some reservations about his mother's bed, and he says that whether it will be covered in spider's web, and he uses again arachnia, the very fine thread. So thinking about these two incidents in parallelism, and having also in mind that Odysseus is always referred to as a very skilled craftsman, and especially a wood crafter, tekton, like he makes the raft, like the Duriosipos, the wooden horse, and the wooden stick with which he blinds Polyphemus, and also Athena's predilection for woodcrafters. And the bed is also Odysseus' making. But when Hephaestus catches Aphrodite, all he cares about, the god, he cares about his status. He cares about the treasures. He cares about what must be given in recompense. But when Penelope says, okay, let's bring out the bed, Odysseus says nothing about treasures, nothing about status. All he says is so many verses about the craft of his hands. So no god would talk about the craft of his hands and how he made and how he inlaid this and how he inlaid that. Not even Hephaestus talks about it. And this is, in my opinion, as I see it, this is what distinguishes the man from the god, and what makes Penelope say that, yes, you're not a god, you are a man, you are Odysseus. Opinion.
Yeah, I was arguing for a parallelism, not an identification, and I think that's true. And I mean, I think it's setting up, ideas about they're both husbands,
Mm-hmm.
and they both have a threat to their household, and they address that threat in rather different ways. So I agree. There Odysseus is definitely a man, and that's essentially he declines Calypso's offer, right, that would make him something more than a man, to return to being a man, which I think is significant. The poet, though, I think does work to reinforce the parallelism. I mean, it's quite interesting that when Euryalus taunts Odysseus and tries to get him to compete, Odysseus says that he's capable of doing almost anything except contests that require running or feet, because his time at sea has weakened his legs. And of course, we have the lame smith god in the story that follows. And that, I think, again, it reinforces a kind of parallelism, but that's different from identification.
No, it's just I was seeing it as a hint to humanness, to Odysseus' humanness, and how Penelope is able to distinguish Odysseus from a god. That's it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
well, that's a wonderful and fascinating passage.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helena. Jackie, you had raised your hand. Thanks.
Oh, hold on. Oh, am I unmuted now? Yeah, okay, hi. Hi, Professor. I am not sure I can explain this really well, but your talk on public shaming reminded me something that's always stuck with me when I first took the course. And Greg had in his the Best of the Achaeans book had mentioned a passage or a poem from, I'm not going to say this right, the one you
Archilochus, yes.
Archilochus, and he says, Carilaos, son of, I can't say it, I will tell you something to be laughed at, your most philos of heteroi, and you will get pleasure hearing it. So here we got, again, the mirth of the people, and it seems to distill down to the incident of Corilla, who was a peasant girl, right? Who was publicly shamed by the king. He threw a shoe at her when she begged for food, and then she goes, hangs herself. So where does the mirth end and the public humiliation comes in? And this is why is it a shoe such a public humiliation, other than maybe she was just disrespected to the degree she gets a dirty old shoe thrown at her?
Well, a lot of those stories, of course, play on the sort of differentials in power, king and the commoner, failure to respect. I mean, Greek world, there was a fairly complex structure of reciprocal ties and reciprocal obligations. And, so we have people who fail from both ends of the spectrum. And, the king who fails to give the appropriate obligations to someone who's poor, and so on. So mirth is a really tricky. Laughter in the Greek world is a really treacherous thing. I mean, the famous epode of Archilochus against Lycambes, we have bits and pieces of it, right? But he begins by saying, he addresses Lycambes, his enemy, who's apparently changed his mind about Archilochus marrying his daughter, and says, what have you said? Have your wits gone unhinged? Now you will show yourself to be a gelos, a laughing stock to the citizens, the asteoi. And I mean that. This is the attack that actually led, according to the biographical tradition, and that may or may not be correct, to the suicide of Lycambes and maybe the suicide of his whole family. So there's laughter, so there's laughter that's nice. And I mean, we all know that, from a sort of ethological point of view, we smile, we're baring our teeth. And, it's often interesting to sort of, find that sort of movement from the benevolent smile to the one that means you're about to bite someone.
Yeah, it always seems to be like when I think of it as a sense of balance there, that if you're publicly humiliated, you've done something. So, but that humiliation results in a mirth of the public, even though you're public humiliated, the public is getting laughter out of that. So that almost kind of balances the public humiliation. Is that what the
Well, I think there's different modes of laughter, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
there's the laughter that brings us together,
Yeah,
and there's the laughter that separates us. And
yeah.
we still do it. I mean, there are cases where people get laughed at, and it's not the case. It seems to me I saw a clip not too long ago of a Washington press correspondence which somebody got laughed at, and the guy wound up becoming president. I mean, it's amazing how people respond to shame and ridicule.
All right, thank you.
Good. Bill.
Hello, I've enjoyed the lecture very much. I was thinking about shame as punishment and among the gods. And I know Poseidon and Apollo were virtually slaves to the king of Troy for a while where they built the wall. But I can't think of any other humiliation as punishment among the gods.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, Ares does take it more than once. The story that I mentioned that Alcaeus seems to have told in a poem. Uh, Ares goes to try and negotiate the freedom of his mother, and he winds up looking foolish.
Yeah.
Hard to say since our source is late, but there's that paper, and I've got it on the hand of Villamovit's Hephaestus paper, where he reconstructs that hymn, I think, really quite brilliantly. So there's Ares getting it again. Now, Ares is a funny Olympian, right? I mean, he's, of all my children, I like you the least, is Zeus's attitude, right? He is, as Burkert says so memorably in his Greek religion, he embodies all that is Hassenswert, all that is hateful about war.
Yeah.
And so it's maybe not surprising that he seems to be the butt of jokes. I think if I could think long enough, there would be other cases where certainly a figure like Ares would be humiliated. Now, the one point which I thought you were going to mention was, of course, and this has often come into the reading of Ares and Aphrodite, is the episode at the end of Iliad 1, where the unextinguishable laughter erupts when Hephaestus is serving drinks.
Right.
And, so someone said, well, the formula there, they're laughing at him, therefore they have to be laughing at him in the Odyssey. I'm not sure that's true.
No.
But I would also, I think, maybe argue, and maybe I need some of those drinks that he's serving to do that. I would argue that Hephaestus in that episode wants laughter, gets laughter, and that's actually functional laughter because it diffuses a potentially dangerous situation.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks a lot.
Good. Anybody else have a question? George, please.
It's not strictly relevant, but it brings me to the Scarlet Letter, and it brings me to the couple that were just captured on the Jumbotron, the CEO and his trusted right hand. We still do it. It's part
Oh,
of
yeah.
human nature, and that is one of the most amazing things about the Odyssey, is that it focuses in on elements of human nature that never change and that are part of our heritage. But just a thought.
I always tell my students that one of the most interesting things about studying classics is this combination of the familiar and the different. You know, there are things that unite us as human beings around the world and across time. And then there are also things that separate us. So there are differences in culture, cultural perspective, and that interplay of similarity and difference and affinity and difference is really what makes this a fascinating field to study. And so, yeah, I think Odyssey has a lot to say to us. And I think, you know, whenever I set out talk about Dodd's view of shame culture, I always say that, you know, in saying that we're a guilt culture, underestimates the degree to which we still have those mechanisms of shame. And we all know people, oh dear, you know, when something happens, oh dear, what will the neighbors think? You know, it's my mother. It's a lot of us.
I had a related question. I I could see on the one hand that public humiliation could be a replacement for physical punishment in being, you know, maybe in a way less expensive on society, easy to administer. Um, or I could see it as something that is just an alternative form, but both of them are going on at the same time. And I sort of think, even in my own house with my children, some of my children would have preferred me to hit them than to shame them, whereas the other ones, you know, feared the physical punishment. So my question is, when you look at these examples and these myths, do you see a transition from physical punishment into humiliation, or do you not really see a pattern?
I think there. I mean, I think there's a degree. I mean, always with punishment, there's degrees of punishment, and physical punishment obviously is a little bit different. What I would stress and is the fact that public mockery is a little bit like public lapidation. It is a thing that is a communal act perpetrated on someone. And so if you know, execute someone or whip someone in public, usually there's one person administering the punishment. When everybody's laughing, it's the whole group and it brings everybody together. Public lapidation works well, right? Same thing, right? Everybody throws stones. We all do it. We're all complicit in it. A Greek sacrifice, right? We all throw barley at it before the actual death blow, which makes us complicit in it. And, you know, we want to involve the community. Sophocles' Antigone, when Creon begins to worry about his own authority, he changes from public lapidation to exile in the cave because he's not entirely sure everybody's going to turn up and participate in the stoning. So I think for me, that's the most interesting part of this. You know, in terms of status, I think both physical punishment and mockery can be equally destructive of one's standing in a community.
Alan,
See a couple of
please.
hands.
Yeah.
Hi,
Jack, you're next.
I'm sorry,
Yep.
I was muted. First, I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. Very interesting. What you just said made me think of Iliad too, when Odysseus
Thersites.
shame. Yeah, exactly. He both are there. The shame and the hitting. I mean, the physical punishment, and all the Greeks are laughing. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's an excellent
Yeah.
parallel.
Jack, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. Well, I think this was a really brilliant presentation, and it really opens a lot of other windows that we haven't really pulled the blinds away from. I was thinking you had in your bibliography an article by Braswell about relationship to the structure of the Odyssey as a whole, which seems to me like something that you can see it in as a gem, to look at different ways and see what Odysseus could be either Ares or Hephaestus,
Well,
depending on what part of the story you take it.
Braswell actually makes the argument about connecting Odysseus with Euryalus or Hephaestus and Ares with Euryalus and Odysseus, and it's a good piece. And as George will know, that's another U of T connection, since Bruce started out at the University of Toronto.
Another thing I thought about is the parallel of the monkey, like the trained monkey, and the monkey character in folklore, Aesop, the Pachatantra, and Kalila Wadimna. In Kalila Wadimna, there's a story about the monkey and the carpenter, where it's not exactly that a trap set, but the carpenter leaves the log that he's splitting unattended with the monkey there, and the monkey tries to do what he's seen the carpenter doing, and first he gets his tail caught in what he split, and then trying to get his tail out, the log comes to, and he gets his testicles crushed. So anyway, these make a point stories where the punishment is in the hoist on your petard
Monkeys,
action of nature.
I keep thinking about good dissertation topics, and there's still a lot of work to be done on monkeys in the ancient world, apes. I mean, that myth about the Cercopes is fascinating. If you don't know, there's a really fine presentation of it all in Bob Fowler's commentary on the early Greek mythographers. It's a really obscurely attested myth, but in some versions, they become monkeys, and some versions they're sort of monkeyish. They are connected with the island, of course, of Pithecusae,
Yeah.
Monkey Island.
Right.
Monkeys are interesting.
Indeed.
All right,
Well,
let's
thank you so much for all of it.
let's we've really run out of time, so let's thank our speaker again. It really was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you all for your attention. I find really valuable to do these things because the questions are always good and makes me think about things. And I'm at the age where I have to force myself to think, so I'm grateful for it.
We really appreciate your time,
Wonderful.
and thanks everybody.
Thank you, Professor.